on the morning of June 20th, 1837, an 18-year-old girl was shaken awake at 6 a.m. and told she was now Queen of England. Her first personal command wasn't a proclamation. It wasn't a prayer. She ordered her bed removed from her mother's bedroom, the room she had slept in every single night of her life. Most people picture Queen Victoria as history's ultimate matriarch, the grandmother of Europe. But behind the family portraits lies one of the coldest mother-daughter wars ever fought inside a palace. And its final chapter would shatter the Queen herself. The mother in this story was born Marie-Louise Victoire on August 17, 1786, in the small German duchy of Coburg. By her early 30s, she had already lived an entire life. Married at 17, widowed at 27, left ruling a tiny principality as regent for her young son. Then, in 1818, Britain came calling. Princess Charlotte, the only legitimate heir to the British throne, had died in childbirth. And King George III's aging sons launched a frantic, faintly ridiculous race to marry and produce a replacement. One of them, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, was 50 years old and drowning in debt. He proposed to the widowed Victoire. She was 31. She said yes. On May 24th, 1819, at 4:15 in the morning, their daughter was born at Kensington Palace, Alexandrina Victoria. The Duke adored her. He had exactly 8 months to do so. On January 23rd, 1820, he died of pneumonia at Sidmouth, aged 52. Leaving his widow stranded in a foreign country with an infant, limited English, and devastating debts. The Duchess of Kent was 33 and utterly alone. From that January onward, she began writing every week in a small private book, pouring her grief onto pages almost no one knew existed. That quiet little habit would one day matter more than anyone alive could have guessed. Into this shattered household stepped the Duke's former equerry, an ambitious Irish officer named Sir John Conroy. He became the Duchess's comptroller and took charge of her chaotic finances. Then, piece by piece, he took charge of everything else. What he and the Duchess built next would poison the royal family for 40 years. They called it the Kensington System. And it turned a child's home into something chillingly close to a cage. Victoria slept in her mother's bedroom every single night. She was never, under any circumstances, left alone in a room. She could not walk down a staircase without holding an adult's hand, a rule that persisted into her late teens. Her playmates were limited almost entirely to her half-sister Theodora and Conroy's own daughter. She was even required to keep a daily behavior book, grading her own conduct like a prisoner filing reports on herself. Surviving pages of it were put on public display in 2014. A schoolgirl's handwriting cataloguing her own failures. Her lessons ran on a rigid timetable. Her meals were reportedly plain to the point of joyless, and every visitor was supervised. The purpose wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was colder than that. It was political. If the old king died while Victoria was still a minor, the Duchess would rule Britain as regent, and Conroy, the man historians would come to see as the true architect of the system, would hold the real power behind her. The plan required one thing: a princess too weak, too isolated, and too dependent to ever say no. But the system had a flaw its builders never saw coming. First, the rumors. Whispers spread that the Duchess and Conroy were lovers. Gossip deliberately pumped into society by Victoria's uncle, the Duke of Cumberland, to discredit them both. It stuck for decades. But no letter, no witness, no shred of primary evidence has ever surfaced to support it, and Victoria herself later rejected the idea. The scandal was a smear. The control, however, was completely real. And the person trapped inside it was starting to notice. In 1830, everything escalated. King George IV died, William IV took the throne, and 11-year-old Victoria became the clear heiress presumptive. The Duchess and Conroy immediately began parading her around the country on grand public progresses, presenting her to the nation like a product launch, while keeping her almost entirely away from the king's court. William IV, a blunt old sailor, was furious. He genuinely liked his little niece. He loathed her mother. In 1831, the Duchess even kept Victoria home from the king's own coronation over dispute about precedence. Later, she reportedly commandeered a suite of 17 rooms at Kensington Palace without the king's consent. The feud between the palace and Kensington was now open warfare, and in 1835 it reached the sickbed of a 16-year-old girl. That autumn, Victoria fell gravely ill with typhoid. She was weak, feverish at her lowest point, and that is precisely when Conroy and her mother chose to strike. They pressed the sick teenager to sign a document appointing Conroy her private secretary. The moment she became queen, a pen pushed at a girl who could barely sit up. That, apparently, was Conroy's idea of bedside care. Victoria, exhausted, isolated, 17 years from power, refused. She simply would not sign. It was the first crack in the system, the first hint that the puppet had a will of iron. The next blow came from the throne itself, in front of 100 witnesses. August 21st, 1836, King William IV's birthday dinner. Roughly 100 guests, the Duchess of Kent seated in the place of honor. The king rose and delivered one of the most brutal public humiliations in royal history. He prayed aloud that God would spare his life another 9 months so that the crown would pass directly to Victoria and never touch the hands of the woman beside him. A woman, he declared, surrounded by evil advisers and, in his words, incompetent to act with propriety. The Duchess sat frozen. Victoria burst into tears. As birthday toasts go, it was a catastrophe. But here's the jaw-dropping part. The old king got his wish almost to the day. Victoria turned 18 on May 24th, 1837, exactly 9 months later. 3 weeks and 6 days after that, William IV was dead. And the girl from the cage was queen. William died at 2:12 in the morning on June 20th, 1837. At 6 a.m., the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Conyngham arrived at Kensington to inform Victoria. She received them by herself, in her sitting room, still in her dressing gown, the first time in her life she had conducted any business without a chaperone. In her journal that day, one word appears again and again, underlined by sheer repetition: alone. She held her first Privy Council alone. She saw her ministers alone. And before the day was out, her bed was gone from her mother's room, after 18 years and 27 days of enforced togetherness, ended in a single morning. Conroy was permanently barred from her presence, that same day forever. The system built to make Victoria helpless had instead taught her exactly one lesson: how absolute control works. And now she had it. What followed was a freeze-out of ruthless efficiency. The Duchess was moved to distant apartments in Buckingham Palace, far from her daughter. Contact shrank to almost nothing, reportedly, at times, to formal written notes passed between a mother and daughter living under the same roof. The emotional vacancy was filled by Baroness Lezen, Victoria's fiercely loyal, fiercely possessive former governess, the surrogate mother who had shielded her through the Kensington years. As for Conroy, the parasite finally got his payoff in 1839, when the Duke of Wellington persuaded him to leave the country. After 19 years of scheming for a peerage and real power, he received a minor baronetcy and a pension. Victoria didn't reward his service. She paid him to disappear. It seemed like the story was over. The villains banished, the Queen triumphant. But the coldest years were still ahead, and they belonged to the Duchess. Picture her position. Stripped of influence overnight, publicly known to be frozen out by her own child. On February 10th, 1840, Victoria married her cousin, Prince Albert. The Duchess attended, but the chill remained. It was Albert, patiently and deliberately, who began the repair work. He understood that a royal family at war with itself was a political liability, and he may also have simply pitied his aunt. Children helped. After the Princess Royal arrived in November 1840, the Duchess was gradually allowed back in, first as a visitor, then as a devoted, doting grandmother. In 1842, Albert finally maneuvered the jealous Lezen out of the household, removing the last wall between mother and daughter. The Duchess settled at Frogmore House, near Windsor, and for the first time in decades, the two women grew genuinely warm. Then, in 1854, Conroy died, and the truth about him came spilling out. When her comptroller examined the accounts, the scale of the betrayal was staggering. Conroy had systematically bled the household he controlled. Nearly £50,000 from the Duchess's brother Leopold, 10,000 more from William IV, money simply unaccounted for after 1829. In modern purchasing power, sums running into the millions. The Duchess herself admitted it. The man who had spent 19 years posing as the family's indispensable protector had been robbing a widow the entire time, while wrecking her bond with her daughter as the price of his ambition. Victoria and her mother had both, in different ways, been his victims. They had roughly 7 good years left to enjoy the peace. Then came March 1861. Early that month, the Duchess, now 74, underwent surgery for an abscess on her arm. The wound turned septic. On March 15th, Victoria and Albert rushed to Frogmore, and the Queen sat through the night at her mother's bedside. At around 9:30 the next morning, March 16th, 1861, the Duchess of Kent died, with Victoria holding her hand. The daughter, who had once refused to be alone in a room with her, was gripping her fingers as she slipped away. Victoria collapsed into grief so extreme it alarmed the court, writing that her mother lay like a marble statue. But the true devastation hadn't arrived yet. It was waiting in the drawers. Back at the very beginning of this story, a young widow started writing in a small book every week, beginning in January 1820, the month her husband died. Now, 41 years later, her daughter found it. In the weeks after the death, Victoria sorted through her mother's papers at Frogmore, and what she uncovered dismantled the story she had told herself for decades. Her father's writing desk, preserved untouched. His last 3 letters to the Duchess inside, along with a drawing of the room where he died. The little weekly book, filled with grief and longing. Account books of Victoria's own babyhood, kept lovingly for 40 years. Scraps of her childhood handwriting. Locks of her baby hair, saved like treasure. Victoria wrote to her family that the papers revealed such unbounded tenderness, and the realization broke over her not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, letter after letter, as she read. The mother she had cast as her jailer had adored her the entire time. A woman manipulated and robbed by Conroy. Guilty of terrible judgment, but never of not loving her child. And there was no longer anyone to say it to. Victoria had discovered her real mother in a drawer of papers days after burying her. 9 months later, Albert was dead too, and the Queen vanished into black for the rest of her life. Mourning a husband the world remembers, and a mother she had learned to love only when the loving was done. Thanks for watching History's Hidden Lives. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us.